Welcome to this What Works Growth video on evaluation. In this video, I want to talk to you about how we construct comparison groups for using in impact evaluation. So here is the kind of situation that we are often interested in evaluating. Here's a policy, a training program, which takes unemployed people and provides them with training. On the left, we see the 10 unemployed people before they go onto the training course. And on the right, we see what happened after the training course. 8 of these people have gone on to find jobs that they didn't have before. That is 80% of the trainees were employed. And we want to know if they got the jobs because of the training course. Now, the impact evaluation challenge here is that they may have gone on to get those jobs anyhow. So how does impact evaluation solve this problem and establish that the training program really had a causal impact on employment? Well, it does it by using a comparison group. So instead of just looking at the change in outcome for those in the program, so instead of just comparing the before and after for the participants, we also look at the change in outcomes for a similar group of people who are not in the program. So to reiterate, we establish causality by using a comparison group and looking at the change in outcome for those in the program and comparing that to the change in outcome for those who are not in the program. Now, the crucial thing here is that the people that we make the comparison for need to be similar to those that are receiving the training. And the trick to doing good impact evaluation is the methods that we use to construct that similar comparison group. Now, here's an example that tries to give you a feeling for why this isn't always as simple as we would like. Here is a training program, and on the left is a treatment group, and on the right is a comparison group or a control group that we have constructed to be as similar as possible to the treatment group. So in this particular example, we've got a training program that focuses on women aged 25 to 30 with low qualifications. And we see that of those in the training group, 6 people were employed that wouldn't have been employed anyway. And how we work that out is we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 people in the treatment group getting a job. So 8 trainees get a job. But in the control group of women aged 25 to 30 with low qualifications who didn't get the training, 2 of them still got jobs anyhow. And so we conclude that 2 of the people in the treatment group would have gone on to get employment even if we hadn't offered the training. So the causal impact of the program is to increase employment by 6 out of 10 or 60%, rather than the 80% that we would have concluded if we had just looked at the treatment group on its own. Now, what's the problem? The problem is that with very many programs, we allow people to self-select into the treatment group. And we've represented that here by highlighting in sort of pinkish red some highly motivated individuals. And those highly motivated individuals, they're all women, aged 25 to 30 with low qualifications, but they are highly motivated and really, really want to get a job. And that causes all kinds of problems for us because now the control group and the treatment group aren't similar. Yes, they're similar on the observables, on the things that we know about the 2 different groups, that they're women, they're aged 25 to 30, and that they have low qualifications. But they're different on an unobservable, and that unobservable is to do with how highly motivated the individuals are. And this can cause a lot of bias because, of course, highly motivated individuals are not just more motivated to do training, but they will also be more motivated when they are searching for a job. And so you can imagine that in this circumstance here, we will see a bias arise as a result of this self-selection on the basis of unobservable characteristics. And we need in our impact evaluation to find a way to deal with this selection problem. Now, there are various different ways of doing this, and I'm going to talk through 3 different ways. And I'm going to rank them from gold standard, so the best way that we know of dealing with this self-selection problem, through a silver standard and then a bronze standard. So 3 different ways of dealing with this. So the gold standard is to run what's known as a randomized control trial. This is the way to be certain that your findings are not biased as a result of this self-selection. Now, as an aside, the example that we're talking about here is randomly allocating people between treatment and no treatment to tell us about the impact of the program. It's also possible to construct randomized control trials that tell us about different types of treatment or different policy designs. Okay, so we could have 2 different ways of delivering a training program, and we allocate people randomly to the different arms. So this is telling us about which design or type of treatment is more effective. But like I said, in what we're doing at the moment, we're focusing on the difference between treatment and no treatment group to tell us the impact of the program. Now, randomization can't get rid of the impact of those unobserved variables on the outcomes. It can't help, it can't deal with the fact that there are some more motivated people out there who are both more likely to want to sign up to training and more likely to get a job than others because of the fact that they're motivated. But what it does do is, by randomly assigning people into a treatment and a control group, it removes the impact of that unobserved characteristic on the measured outcomes from the evaluation, because some self-motivated people end up in the treatment group and some self-motivated people end up in the control group. So here we've got the training program example again. These are a treatment group and a control group that look similar on paper, so similar on the basis of the observables. They're all women, they're all aged 25 to 30, they all have low qualifications. But now, if we randomize, we end up with some highly motivated people in the treatment group and some highly motivated individuals in the control group. And so now when we measure the differences in outcomes across the groups, we are controlling for both selection on observables and on those unobservables that some of these women are more motivated than others. And so we see that here, the difference between the number of people getting a job in the treatment group and the number of people getting a job in the control group is 5 rather than the 6 that we had before, because now some of those self-motivated or highly motivated individuals are in the control or comparison group. So randomization helps us ensure that the 2 groups look similar on both observable and unobservable characteristics that matter for outcomes. So the gold standard is a randomized control trial. It's the only way to be certain that your findings are not biased by unobservable things about individuals. And of course, what's true for individuals can also be true for firms and for areas. If firms differ on unobservable characteristics that are related to both their likelihood of being treated and the outcomes that we observed after treatment, then we need something like randomization to help address that. And similarly for areas. Now, in randomized control trials, we as the evaluators come along and impose randomization. In many circumstances, that isn't possible, or either because of practical reasons or because policymakers don't want to explicitly randomize. And then the silver standard, the second best, is to exploit some natural randomness to make sure that the control group and the treatment group are as similar as possible on both the basis of observable and unobservable characteristics. So one way of doing this, for example, is to use timing or a wait list. So let's imagine that we get lots of people coming forward for training programs, and that we can only take a certain number of those people into any cohort of the training program. Then we can use the group of people who want to do the training program but haven't yet been allocated a place as the control group for those that we allocate to the training program in the first place. So now we know that highly motivated individuals will be in both the treatment and the control group because they will have come forward with training, but some of them will have been made to wait. So using timing or wait lists can create randomness because we get people with the same unobservable characteristics in both groups. Another example of using natural randomness is that we can exploit thresholds. Let's imagine that we have a policy that only applies for areas which are below some unemployment rate. Okay, so we have lots and lots of eligible areas applying for some kind of support from a policy, and we decide that we are only going to support those that have unemployment higher than 20%. So the implementation of the policy imposes some threshold. Well, actually, there's not that much difference between an area with unemployment rate 20.5% and an area with unemployment rate 19.5%. It's just that we imposed a threshold that said, if you've got unemployment of 20.5%, you're eligible for the policy. If you've got unemployment of 19.5%, you're ineligible for the policy. And so we can use a comparison across those thresholds to get at areas that are likely to be very similar. And we use the change for those just above the threshold and compare it to those just below the threshold. So that's another way of constructing a control group. We can use similar ideas for, say, looking close to the boundaries of an area which we are supporting. So areas just inside a regeneration zone might actually be pretty similar to areas just outside a regeneration zone, and the boundary that we draw is pretty arbitrary. And in those examples, we can use the treated group as those just inside the regeneration zone boundary and the control group as those just outside. So that's a second strategy. A third thing that we can do is to use coincidence. And we saw an example of this recently with the evaluation of the impact of the Eat Out to Help Out scheme, where the take-up of the Eat Out to Help Out scheme varied depending on how hard it happened to rain during August. And of course, whether it rains a lot or a little varies fairly systematically across the country. But if we look at whether it rained unusually hard in August, we get variation in the uptake of Eat Out to Help Out that is driven by just, random bad weather. And so we can take places who experienced unusually bad weather and compare them to areas that would have usually had the same weather but happened to have a sunnier August. And then the variation in take-up, it's unrelated to anything to do with the characteristics of the area, and everything to do with the fact that they were just unlucky this summer and had a more rainy summer than usual. And then we can look at differences in outcomes, so employment or turnover of restaurants, and see how that relates to their take-up of Eat Out to Help Out, with the take-up of Eat Out to Help Out being randomly driven by whether or not the weather was bad. Now, sometimes these sort of ideas for exploiting this natural randomness can go by all kinds of different names. So you'll see quasi-experimental, natural experiment, instrumental variables, and regression discontinuity designs are all ways of exploiting some of this natural randomness, of which I've given examples here. If you can't do that, still better to do similar on paper. Okay, so when there is no sensible, proportionate way of getting around selection on unobservables, when we know that there are some highly motivated individuals or highly motivated firms, but we've got no way of knowing who is who, then it's still important to concentrate on at least trying to control for the observables that are really likely to explain outcomes. So going back to the example of the training program, we at least want to make the comparison to women in a similar age group with similar qualifications. So this is certainly better than making no comparison at all, because making no comparison at all can be very misleading. Now, you know, I've ranked these as gold, silver, and bronze, and emphasized the value of doing the gold or silver relative to this bronze similar on paper. But similar on paper would still be better than most of the evidence currently available. If you want to have a look at some of the evidence reviews that the What Works Centre did, this bronze here is our minimum evidence standard. So we will take things that apply these bronze methods. So they're referred to in different ways: difference in difference, or matching, or propensity score matching, or synthetic controls. They're all kind of using similar ideas, controlling on these observables. When we apply those as a minimum evidence standard, in our employment training review, we identified over 1,000 things that claim to be evaluations. Only about 70 of them applied some kind of comparison group that at a minimum compared outcomes for those going through the training program to outcomes for those who were similar on paper but not going through the training program. So just to recap, impact evaluation establishes causality by using a comparison group. We compare change in outcome for those in the program to the change in outcome for those not in the program. And the crucial thing here is that we need the treatment and the comparison groups to be as similar as possible. And in this video, I've talked through the 3 broad sets of ways of finding a comparison group that are as similar as possible to those who are being treated in the program.
Hopefully, by this point, we have convinced you that it's a good idea to evaluate your interventions and persuaded you that it's doable. So hopefully we have mitigated some of your concerns about how time-consuming or resource-intensive or complicated it is. In this section, we're going to look at the process of undertaking an evaluation. So I'm going to set out some simple steps that you can follow that should hopefully help you get started and make sure that your evaluation is good quality. Our first suggestion is to start early. Often, policymakers don't think about evaluation until the end of the project, and that's too late. So it can be too late to be able to collect or access the data and information that you need to undertake the evaluation, and it also really limits your options in terms of the kinds of evaluations that you can do. So if we think about a randomised controlled trial, what you need to do is allocate potential participants to either a treatment group or a control group. And obviously you can't do that after the programme as finished. So you need to think about your evaluation design as early as possible, and ideally while your policy is being designed. So this helps ensure that the right data is being collected, that you've got processes in place to track participants, and it can also really be helpful in terms of reducing costs and avoiding duplication. We also think, for what it's worth, that if you think about evaluation at an early stage, it will help you design a better policy or programme or project. So our next suggestion is to define success. So what is it that you're trying to achieve through your intervention? What are your objectives? So this takes us back to the logic model that we talked about earlier. So are you trying to increase employment? Are you trying to improve productivity or something else? It doesn't really matter what it is, but you need to have it clearly defined. And this is important really because this is what your evaluation is going to measure. It's important not just to define it, but to define it as clearly as possible. So, for example, you might define what your intervention is trying to do as helping businesses grow, but what does that actually mean? So a much clearer specification or a much clearer definition would be that we're trying to help businesses grow their employment, or to grow their turnover, or to grow their exports or their market shares. So the more specific you can be, the better. The next suggestion is to think about what you're going to evaluate. So this maybe seems like a slightly odd question. So what we've talked about throughout this course is what you want to know is whether or not your intervention led to the changes that you observe. So if we go right back to the original example, did the training course lead to participants moving into employment? And that is one option. And that's an option that I suppose we would characterise as what works. But there is another option, which is what works better. So your evaluation can take a number of different alternatives. So that might be policy design. So if we go back to the training option, do short courses or long courses work better in terms of helping an unemployed person move into work? So again, this is a question about getting some clarity about what it is your evaluation is going to focus on. The final one on this slide, there is another slide, is about finding a control group. So we spent a lot of this course talking about counterfactuals and control groups, and it's this that makes an impact evaluation an impact evaluation as opposed to some other form of evaluation or research. And this is the point in the process where you should be applying that learning. The next step is to collect your data. There are two types of data that you need. The first is that you need data on your programme participants, so for example on their characteristics. And the second is that you need data on outcomes. And there's two dimensions to the outcome data that are important. So the first is that you need data on outcomes from both before participation and after participation. So if we take a policy that is supporting businesses to grow their turnover, we would want to know both what their turnover was before they participated in the programme and what their turnover was after participation, or perhaps 12 months or 24 months after participation. The second dimension is that you need to collect outcome data for both your treatment group, so those that participate, and your control group. So it's these two dimensions, looking at before and after, and looking at a treatment group and a control group, that make it an impact evaluation. You can get data essentially in two types of ways. So either you can collect it yourself, for example through a survey, or you can make use of data that's been collected by someone else. So we tend to call this secondary data. So the Office for National Statistics collects lots of data, government departments collect various data that would be useful, and increasingly companies collect data. So for example, things like Google mobility trends are increasingly used in evaluation of transport interventions. The next question is how long, or maybe another way to think of this is when to evaluate. So ideally, you would evaluate when your policy or program's outcomes have come through. But the thing is that varies. So for something like a training program that's meant to be helping an individual move into employment, the outcomes might come through quite quickly. But for some other policies, it can take a long time, often years, for the outcomes to come through. So for example, if you were offering a grant to businesses to undertake R&D with the hope that that would lead to more new products and in turn a growth in turnover or employment, there might be a number of years between making that initial investment and actually you seeing that increase in turnover or employment. Transport interventions and other infrastructure often have the longest gap. And there's a bit of a challenge here. So ideally you would wait until the outcomes have come through, but we want to embed evaluation into the policy cycle. So we want to use it to help inform future decision making. So often you need to measure before all of the outcomes have come through in order to be able to timely feed into that process. The next one is plagiarize. So generally plagiarism is a bad thing and you shouldn't do it. But this is one of the few occasions where it's a good thing. So we recommend learning from previous evaluations. So looking at what kind of methods did they use, what data did they utilise, how did they construct their control group. You know, there is no need to reinvent the wheel when you're doing an evaluation. Learn from those that have come before you. And our final recommendation is to get everybody on board. So when we're talking about everybody, what we mean is your funding organisation, your delivery organisations, your partners, and your key decision makers, really. So this is critical for two reasons. One, for the smooth running of your evaluation, but secondly, to make sure that it does feed back into future decision making about what interventions we fund and that we deliver. So, you know, it's important to get everyone involved, but actually it's also really important to get them involved in the evaluation as early as possible. So that's 8 simple steps that should hopefully help you get your evaluation up and running.